And so it's only natural when you look at these goals, look at it through the eyes of globalists helping and facilitating communists. Number one, that they should coexist with communism rather than have atomic war. That was a globalist thing. Containment, number two, to contain that was the doctrine of George Kennan, who was a globalist, not a communist. And so you see globalists facilitating all of these doctrines. Developing in number three, the notion of total disarmament by the U.S. would be the highest moral standard. And of course, your nuclear freeze people were very much associated with the Communist Party, and were a lot of communists involved in the anti-nuclear movement. And, you know, they would promote in number four, free trade between all nations, and we shouldn't exclude communists from free trade. So it wasn't really free trade. It was facilitating trade with communists so that you could share technology with them, is what we did all through China and Russia's history. Number five was extend long-term loans to Russia and the Soviet satellites. Now you can see, obviously, the communists would be in favor of this, but the globalists were also in favor of this as well. Number six was to provide American aid to all nations, regardless of communist domination. Same thing like long-term loans, aid. You don't want to be prejudiced against communists. Number seven was grant recognition of Red China and admit Red China to the UN and oust Taiwan. I mean, it's one thing to admit Red China, but why oust Free China, Taiwan? And why give Red China a seat on the Security Council, a permanent seat with a permanent veto? That's got to be for conflict creation purposes and to make sure that China and Russia can stop any actual freedom agenda. And that's exactly what they did.
Joining us for the balance of the hour is Joel Skousen, editor of worldaffairsbrief.com. And I wanted to get him on because his uncle, Cleon Skousen, basically researched and developed the goals of communism from some of their own documents and public statements that got read into the record in 1963. And when you read the goals of communism and you see how much of it has actually been achieved, it is stunning. So we reposted this to Infowars.com. Read the secret 45 goals of communism leaked to Congress in 1963. In the early 1960s, U.S. intelligence obtained the 45 goals communist internationals intended to carry out to destroy Western civilization and Christianity. And Joel Skousen joins us to get into this because his uncle helped expose it and how the ultra-rich want command and control. They're making a lot of money right now off the collapse of Venezuela. And then later in the hour, we can tie it into current events and things that are unfolding. But going back to the 60s and the naked communist and W. Cleon Skousen and your uncle, and now where we are today, it's just amazing.
Well, the first point I want to make, Alex, is that my uncle wrote this in the early 60s based upon his research as assistant to J. Edgar Hoover administrative assistant at the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. But he had not yet discovered the globalist conspiracy yet. To him, everything looked like a communist conspiracy. And as I've gone through these 45 goals in preparation for your show today, it's very interesting because from our perspective now, and even if Cleon were alive today, he died in 2006, if he were alive today, he would agree with me that these goals, in fact, were globalist goals, not exclusive communist goals. And the reason they got pushed through the Communist Party is the globalists were using communists to break down the social order, to break down various countries like Nicaragua and Cuba and Red China. But these were actually engineered by globalists. And that's why, even though most of them have not been implemented by actual communists, they have happened because the globalists have continued to do that, even after they dismantled the House Committee on Un-American Activities, even though they got rid of McCarthy. These goals kept going forward because these are globalist goals which share a great commonality with communism. But he realized that it was much broader than just the communist conspiracy, that there were these wealthy capitalists that were controlling the communists, or at least facilitating them coming into the United States. And those communists themselves thought that the globalists were one of them, but they weren't. They were secretly facilitating it and then planning on discarding communism later on after.
And then along comes, years later, in the late 60s, Quigley, from the globalist perspective, just certifying from the inside in 1,100 pages everything that your uncle has said.
That's exactly right. And so the book, The Naked Capitalist, really is a critique of Carroll Quigley's book, who was a professor at Georgetown. Georgetown is full of globalists. Even today, they're the ones that teach at the National War College and indoctrinate all of our military officers so that they turn out to be globalists. Anybody who gets to be a general or an admiral has to say yes to those systems. And so it's only natural when you look at these goals, look at it through the eyes of globalists helping and facilitating communists. Number one, that they should coexist with communism rather than have atomic war. That was a globalist thing. Containment, number two, to contain that was the doctrine of George Kennan, who was a globalist, not a communist. And so you see globalists facilitating all of these doctrines. Developing in number three, the notion of total disarmament by the U.S. would be the highest moral standard. And of course, your nuclear freeze people were very much associated with the Communist Party, and were a lot of communists involved in the anti-nuclear movement, but they were being used by the globalists who also wanted.
And that ties into the 7277.
That's exactly right. And, they would promote in number four, free trade between all nations, and we shouldn't exclude communists from free trade. So it wasn't really free trade. It was facilitating trade with communists so that you could share technology with them, was what we did all through China and Russia's history. Number five was extend long-term loans to Russia and the Soviet satellites. Now you can see, obviously, the communists would be in favor of this, but the globalists were also in favor of this as well. Number six was to provide American aid to all nations, regardless of communist domination. Same thing like long-term loans, aid. You don't want to be prejudiced against communists. Number seven was grant recognition of Red China and admit Red China to the UN and oust Taiwan. I mean, it's one thing to admit Red China, but why oust Free China, Taiwan? And why give Red China a seat on the Security Council, a permanent seat with a permanent veto? That's got to be for conflict creation purposes and to make sure that China and Russia can stop any actual freedom agenda. And that's exactly what they did. Number eight was to set up East and West Germany as separate states, in spite of Khrushchev's promise in 1955 to settle the German question by free elections. And number nine was promote the conferences to ban atomic tests, and that got through, but that was a globalist agenda as well. Number 10 was to allow all Soviet satellite countries individual representation in the UN. That was passed, but by globalists, not necessarily by communists. And of course, they are free now, most of those states now, and still members of the UN. But I still contend that most of those have puppet governments that are owing to the Soviets, just like Poland and Czechoslovakia under Václav Havel were communist agents. Going to point number 11, they want to promote the UN as the only hope for mankind. And if its charter is rewritten, demand that they set it up as a one world government with its own independent armed forces. Now, that won't happen and hasn't happened yet, but that's what World War III is all about. And absorbing a nuclear first strike on U.S. military forces so that our globalist leaders can come out of their bunkers and induce everyone to join a militarized global government. That's point number 11. That's a globalist point. Remember that the communists have never really promoted the UN as its only hope for mankind. They want to form their own type of new world order under communist control. China wants to form their own. So they're competing against the Western globalists who want this form, the most sophisticated, deceiving form, because you see, only the globalists are sophisticated enough to tell people you're still free, you still have democracy, you still have individual rights, like they do in the EU Constitution. But then there are all these exceptions built in. Number 12 is resisting any attempt to outlaw the Communist Party. This is all about the censorship thing. The liberals are very good about saying, we don't want to ban anybody, but when it comes to Alex Jones and InfoWars, they do want to ban you. In other words, communists are okay, but the ultra-right, the extremists as they call us, that's never okay, and we will face a ban just as we are in Germany.
And we're not really what they even call ultra-right. Aren't we just traditional nationalists?
Yes, they're against that too. They're against anyone who's in favor of promoting Western civilization or culture. You know, you can have a Black Power club at high school. You can have a Latino club. You can have you can use black, you can use Latino, you can use every name except white. You cannot have anything that promotes the Caucasian culture or race. Number 13, they want to do away with loyalty oaths. Now, that loyalty oaths came about because of the McCarthy era and taking a loyalty oath. But, you know, we still have the constitutional oath. Unfortunately, it is not being enforced. Nobody has been prosecuted for violating the Constitution. It's just a hollow form of an oath that we use today. Number 14, continue giving Russia access to the U.S. Patent Office. That was a globalist goal because that's how they gave Russia technology secrets without directly transferring the technology.
And look at China today. They take it the day it's posted there.
That's exactly right. Number 15, capture one or both political parties in the U.S. Now, the communists never did this, but the globalists, of course, have done both. They've captured both the Democratic and Republican parties and run them, you know, as Party A and Party B, but they're both globalist parties. Number 16, use technical decisions of the courts to weaken basic American institutions. This is done through the ACLU, Fabian Socialists, and others, which started out as outright communist fronts and now have a more mainstream view. But in point of fact, they have controlled now the actual courts, and not because the judges themselves are communists, but they are globalists. And those that aren't globalists that are under control or under blackmail. They have a tremendous amount of blackmail of judges to keep them in control, especially those who are ostensibly conservatives in the Supreme Court, like Justice Roberts and Justice Thomas. They have ample blackmail on them to turn them, as they did Justice Roberts in the Obamacare decision. Number 17, get control of the schools. Well, frankly, the communists have not got control of the schools, but the globalists certainly have. And that's been going on ever since the founding of the public school movement. Was meant to take it away from private hands, take it away from...
And a great example is Bill Gates. They use the government running it to ruin it, and then have the new corporate takeover that's even worse, which is the globalization of schools.
That's exactly right. Gain control, number 18, of all student newspapers. Well, there really aren't a lot of communists except in a few major Ivy League universities, but it's hard to tell the difference between a hardcore communist and a hardcore leftist. Number 19 is something communists are very deeply involved and still are to this day, and that is using a student protest. Anytime George Soros wants to gin up a protest against Trump or immigration or gun control, he calls the communist organizers who bring out the student protest. And of course, there's a lot of follow-on people in the public schools because they're all trained in liberalism and in colleges. So it's very easy to go beyond the communist cadres. But those are the core people that they still use to gin up protests. Number 20 is infiltrate the press. That's something the globalists have done much more than the communists. Same thing with 21, which is gain control of key positions in radio, TV, and motion pictures. There were communist-oriented people. A lot of those were soft communists, not outright communist organizers. And the left, of course, is predominant in all of the media here. And it's not just the left-wing media, it really is a pro-government media, which means it's controlled by the globalist control system, the deep state, if you will. CIA pays for a lot of journalists up to $50,000 a year. They pay off judges. They collect these payoffs at casinos oftentimes in chips so that they can launder these bribes to judges. Number 22 through 24 talk about discrediting and destroying American Western culture. While that's a communist goal, that's also a globalist goal. That's what creating conflict and driving Muslim refugees into Europe is all about. That's what's driving Latin Americans to the United States, not so much because they're that much different in culture, but because it waters down the conservative voting values. But, you know, you control art critics, you control and get rid of laws controlling obscenity, and you loosen up censorship when it comes to communism, but then you tighten down censorship when it comes to the right wing, which we're seeing and talking about today. Promoting pornography, 25, that's been done. You know, a lot of these things like obscenity and pornography, there's a tremendous amount of satanic influence in the lives of people that promotes this. You don't have to be a communist to get on this bandwagon for promoting uh, the libertine lifestyle and the pornography. I mean, there's a natural man incentive to go that direction. This combined with the next goals, 27, 28, and 29, about eliminating religion as eliminating prayer in schools and religious expressions by government. This is very much the dumbing down of religion, and a lot of it's voluntary. Pastor Chuck Baldwin has been very vocal about the fact that the mainstream churches just won't take a stand. But you know, the goals 29 and 30 discredit the U.S. Constitution as old-fashioned and discredit the founding fathers. That's really been taken over by the liberals in the universities. The globalists aren't trying anymore to get rid of the Constitution. They are content to control the Constitution through legal interpretation. Of course, you have control of teachers of American history so that you distort American history and culture and refuse to talk about the things that really enhance the Second Amendment or the Christian base of American culture. All that was a communist goal, and it's also a globalist goal. Number 32 is support any socialist movement to give government more centralized control in social agencies, welfare programs especially, drawing upon the heartstrings of Americans to give, and internationally as well, even though we're essentially bankrupt as a nation. Number 34 eliminated the House Committee on Un-American Activities. They did do that. That was through American liberals, not through the communists themselves. Number 35 has not happened, discredited and eventually dismantled the FBI. Basically, the deep state took over the FBI, as we've seen with Comey and Mueller and even now with Christopher Wray, an insider in the FBI. They did not dismantle it and don't intend to dismantle it because they've now co-opted the FBI, made it a tool of the deep state. Infiltrate and control more unions. Yes, that occurred in spades. Unions used to be especially totally controlled by communist front organizations. Now they're simply, deep into corruption, not necessarily communism. Number 37, they did not gain control of big business, but the globalists did. Goal number 38 was to transfer some of the arrest powers of police to social agencies. Now, while that hasn't happened, what has happened is a subsidiary of that goal to treat all behavioral problems as psychiatric orders, to give psychiatrists more power to incarcerate people for psychiatric. That's a thing that the communists were very, very good at, the Soviet agency. We're heading towards that. And the left does dominate the psychiatric profession. Psychiatrists refuse to talk about the key things that really understand human behavioral problems. One, the innateness of the spirit of the man, which comes from certain predispositions, some good and some evil, the workings of conscience and how Satan and the Lord interact with people and how they reject the Lord sometimes and get taken over by satanic influence, especially suicide or use a gun to commit crimes, etc. Those are something that psychiatrists cannot cure society's ills or even analyze them correctly without understanding the role of conscience and the role of Satan to speak to people's minds, which they do not accept, unfortunately. Discredit the family as an institution, number 40, and make a divorce easy. That has happened through liberals, not necessarily through communists. Emphasize the need to raise children away from the negative influence of parents, goal number 41. Now, that is a communist goal, but that has not and will not be implemented directly in the United States. But the role of the public schools in basically taking over the raising of children and indoctrinating them and schooling them and, making them susceptible to homosexuality, that's happening. And that is a globalist goal that has been accomplished. Unlike communist countries, they take children away from parents. Number 42, create the impression that violence and insurrection are legitimate aspects of American tradition. That goes back to the protests and the left background in protests. Number 43 has been fully accomplished. Overthrow all colonial governments and turn them over to pro-communist regimes as they did in Africa. Number 44, internationalize the Panama Canal. The communists, frankly, didn't do that. Jimmy Carter and the globalists did it, and it has helped the communists, but it was more for globalist purposes. And number 45 is very important. It has not happened. Repeal the Connolly Reservation, where this was in accepting the World Court, the U.S. Senate passed the Connolly Reservation, basically that we can reject World Court jurisdiction for anything that interferes with national sovereignty or U.S. internal policy. And other countries have adapted forms of that too, and that's what has kept the world court at bay all of these years. And so that number 45 has not been accomplished. And so in general, what I want to say is that these goals are moving forward under the aegis of globalism, which uses communism, and is very much pointing Americans towards what life is going to be like in a globalist world government.
You know, someone very profoundly once said many years ago that if fascism ever comes to America, it'll come in the name of liberalism.
I'm a nasty woman.
If you are receiving this transmission, you are the resistance.
Thank you all for coming together to represent our party at its best.
I am standing in the middle of 1984 civilization.
Let resistance equal progress.
Yeah, this kind of feels fascist to me, yet they're out here protesting fascism.
They put it in their music videos, they hold up decapitated heads, plays in the New York Public Theater.
Are you trying to fight me, bro? Yeah, trying to engage in political discourse with these people, and you've seen the responses time and time again. And this represents the strength, the courage, and the bravery that we can have freedom and prosperity.
The War Room. Infowars.com/show.
Guaranteeing your food independence is a crucial part of prepping. Between debt crisis, natural disasters, or even simple power outages, having a supply of storable meals is crucial. With InfoWars Life Select storable food, you can make sure you and your family are ready for any emergency. With drinks, snacks, and meals in amounts ranging from 72 hours to a full year, there's no better place to look for healthy, easy, and incredible meals. Including meals such as Traveler Stew, Homestyle Potato Soup, and a variety of other meals for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, InfoWars Life Select storable food will help you eat comfortably in a time of need. They even work great for camping. Simply pack a 72-hour kit to go and you have easy-to-cook and transport food for you and your loved one's trip. Don't be caught surprised by an emergency. Make sure you're stocked up today with all the food you need for an affordable price with InfoWars Life Select storable foods.